Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Bleak. I am your host, Amanda, and I just wanted to hop on here and talk about the 28-page letter that Sarah Boone wrote to Judge Kraynick post-sentencing. A lot of people have been covering this and talking about it. I've watched a lot of different content creators give their take on it. I think that, I like to get all kinds of different perspectives. I have a perspective on this that I haven't really heard anybody say, so I wanted to tell my point of view on the letter and give you guys my thoughts on it, and then you guys can let me know what you think in the comments. So yeah, in true Sarah Boone fashion, she just let the judge have it, and she came across very unhinged and whatnot, but yeah, we'll get into it right now. So I'm going to read it, and then I'll just stop and, give my comments on it throughout, and then, yeah, so let's get started here. So it says, right off the bat, so it's dated December 6, 2024. Right off the bat, it says Mr. Michael Kraynick. So she's already calling him Mr. as opposed to Judge or Your Honor, and that is obviously completely intentional on her part. Then it goes on to say, I am in closing, please, my complete statement to you and the world, as I partially read during my sentencing hearing. By my reserving particular parts of my very true and meaningful statement, I was hoping to have been graced with your forgiveness, understanding, and consideration in any level or degree. For me, unfortunately, and regardless of when I had speak on my behalf, I think she means when I spoke on my behalf, or the number of, what? Sorry, her writing is kind of hard to read at times. Your ignorant mind was already made up. So I think what stands out to me in that paragraph is she's calling Judge Kraynick ignorant. And when you use a word like ignorant when it really doesn't apply, given the fact that, she might not like Judge Kraynick, but describing him as ignorant is just, what does ignorance mean? It means you basically, the way I look at that word anyway, is like you have a strong opinion on something, but you don't have the knowledge about what that opinion is on to back it up. Lack of knowledge. And that is not how I would describe Judge Kraynick. Her use of that word and the name calling comes across as like she's kind of lashing out in anger, post-sentencing. And then she goes on to say, by your clear error and full-blown unfair bias against me since your involvement in my crucible case as a whole, I have been unsuccessful in receiving anything from you as a supposed fair and neutral judge, except for your wish that I spend the rest of my life in prison. So she's saying he's an unfairly biased judge. Again, that's just categorically false. If you look at Judge Kraynick and how he has been with Sarah, he's given her more leeway than I think most judges would. He very much, for example, her little speech at her sentencing hearing, I've actually spoken with some judges that, I know a couple, but I've also listened to a lot of interviews with judges about this case, etc., and I've heard many of them say they would have never let Sarah Boone get away with that grotesque speech at her sentencing hearing, especially when she started to be disrespectful to the victim and the victim's family. I think Judge Kraynick gave her a lot of leeway intentionally because he's thinking about the future and about her potential appeals in the future, but it seems to me like he gave her more leeway and a chance to say what she wanted more so than a lot of other judges would have. Goes on to say, please know and always remember, Mr. Kraynick, that I forgive you, still and sincerely. Please understand also, the judge, according to Cicero, is never to lose sight that he is simply a man and that he cannot exceed the power given to him by his mission. By his commission. That not only power but public confidence has been given to him, that he ought always very seriously to attend, not to his wishes, but to the requisitions of law, of justice, and religion. So, again, she's basically saying, Judge Kraynick has abused his power, he hasn't done his job correctly, he's biased, all things that I find to be just not true in this case. Judge Kraynick has done his job. He always seemed to have a lot of legal arguments to back up his findings. And again, like what she is saying here just doesn't sorry, I'm in my car and I'm being choked by my seatbelt. It doesn't add up. It says, you will never admit your many judicial errors, nor will the prosecutors theirs, meaning their errors, and I will never admit to what you have wrongfully accused me of and judged me as. I am not a murderer, I am a survivor. So, the thing is, Sarah, you're on video committing the crime. So, we're not categorizing you as something that's not true. Like, we have objective evidence that you committed this crime. I think, unfortunately, when it comes to the battered spouse syndrome defense, I think when she found out about that being an option for her, possibly, that she latched on to that as I was justified in what I did, and she has, she's delusional, and she's put herself in this victim mindset, and I don't think she will ever stray from that. I also think that, so the more I think about this case, it used to be like, even in my last video, I made some statements where I'm like, the relationship was toxic, which it was, between George and Sarah, but I said something along the lines of, like, it was mutually abusive. Now I'm, the more I learn, the more I research, the more I think about it, because by definition of the word abuse, someone has to be in a position of power over the other person. So calling any relationship mutually abusive it's not really even a thing that exists. So I actually think that Sarah was 100% the abuser and George had battered spouse syndrome. And I think a big part of how Sarah manipulated George is, they both were struggling with alcoholism. And I think they would drink on a daily basis to the point of often blacking out. I think because, people who struggle with alcoholism often, they're prone to injuries, they have a lot of bruising, and I wholeheartedly believe that she would get injured just from being drunk and, falling or, bumping into something or whatever the case may be. And then the two of them would wake up the next morning and she'd have injuries. And I think she would convince George that he was responsible for those injuries. And I think he would be like, oh my gosh, I lost memory from drinking. And I think he believed her. And then I think he also would feel guilty about it on top of that. And for things that he didn't even actually do. So yeah, I'm totally when I'm wrong about something, I am more than happy to admit it if my mind changes based on getting more information. And so, yeah, when I've said in the past that it was mutually abusive, I mean, I 100%, I don't think that anymore. Let's continue. So she's talking about black robe disease, arrogance, and a judge is a slang term for a judge who flaunts judicial power and dominates proceedings at the expense of the dispensation of justice. So she's saying he has black robe disease, which I take that to mean he is in a position of power and he's become accustomed to being in that position and he abuses that position of power. And there are judges, I'm sure, that do, just like there are police officers who do. I think there's people in every profession that abuse their position. Do I think that applies to Judge Kraynick? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Impartiality is the first duty of a judge before he gives an opinion or sits in judgment in a cause. He ought to be certain and absolute that he has no bias for or against either of the parties. If he has any interest, even the slightest, in the cause, he is disqualified from sitting as a judge, and when aware of such interest, ought to lawfully and justly refuse to sit on a case. The delicacy which characterizes the judges in this country generally forbids their sitting in such a cause. Now, again, she's saying that he has some kind of conflict of interest or preconceived major bias that prevents him from having sat on the case. And, you know, I don't think he knew George or Sarah prior to presiding over the case. He gave her so many chances when going through attorneys. He gave her more chances than he had to legally. The law doesn't necessarily list a number of attorneys that you have to go through before you're forced into being pro se, but it does leave it to the discretion of the judge. And I think, you know, there's room for maybe a chance or two where an attorney and a client just don't get along for whatever reason. I'm sure that happens, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the client is a terrible person or that the lawyer is a bad person. It's just not a relationship that works out. But if it's happening 7 times, 8 times, you know that Taylor Swift song? It's me. Hi. I'm the problem. It's me. Meaning Sarah Boone should be singing that to herself, because that's what that indicates. It's no longer, you know, she's the common denominator there. It's not the attorney. Let's continue. But at the risk of practicing judicial centricism, a word I have coined, centricism? I don't know what she's trying to say. It's a word she's made up, though. A word I have coined in this presentation. Others have called it black robe disease. Whether he was correct or not in my behavior, it is widely accepted that judicial behavior affects the jury. And that's a quote from Murray Ritchell from the Simpson trial in 1996. Now, she's basically trying to say that Judge Kraynick's behavior affected the jury, which is funny because, again, he came across to me as like very neutral, very much trying to make sure that, you know, Sarah got all the rights that are afforded to a defendant. Trial judges are affirmatively charged with securing a fair trial and must intervene. I don't know what that says. Anyway, she's quoting other legal experts or scholars of, you know, she's talking about like what a judge, like what his obligations are, as if he's not aware of what those are. It says that duty encompasses not only the avoidance of error before it occurs, but the fair correction of error that may have occurred earlier in a proceeding. And then she quotes, it's Carlisle versus United States, 1996. Oh boy. So anyway, she's basically going on and on about how, you know, Judge Kraynick was biased against her and treated her unfairly. And the thing is, so her mantra through all of this, and this is the point I wanted to make that a lot of people I don't think are talking about when they're going through this letter, and they're, because she goes on to read her statement, which most of these 28 pages are the statement that she read in court. And I don't think I need to read that again. You guys all heard it. But one of her main points that she goes on and on about, if you recall, is the whole, I forgive Judge Kraynick, I forgive George Torres's family, I forgive, you know, the list goes on and on. And what, you know, I think we can all agree her statement is extremely vile. But what is it about her statement that is so, like, that is just so bothersome? And I think I can put my finger on what that is. Because I've heard a lot of people say, well, you know, she doesn't know how to really forgive people because that's not true forgiveness. And when people say that, I think they're missing the point. Because what's wrong with what she's doing is she's basically saying she gets to determine who needs forgiveness, right? Like, who's done something wrong to her or to anybody that requires forgiveness. And not only that, she gets to decide if that forgiveness is going to happen or not. And the only other person that I can think of, or entity or being, who gets to determine who gets to be forgiven is literally Jesus Christ himself, or God, or, you know, Allah, or Buddha, or whatever you believe in. It's literally the most grandiose line of thinking. These people are the victims of Sarah Boone. They do not need to be forgiven. They didn't do anything wrong to her. And yet she is trying to come across like, oh, I'm forgiving you for all of the bad things you did to me. But these people are not asking to be forgiven because they didn't do anything that warrants her forgiveness. And the fact that she thinks that she can determine who needs forgiveness and she can be the grantor of forgiveness, it's a God complex. So when you're talking about grandiosity and narcissism, like, I know the word narcissism gets thrown around a lot in true crime cases. It does. I think all human beings have some narcissistic traits just by nature of being a human being. But she has a narcissistic personality disorder. And, you know, obviously, like, I'm not her therapist. I can't give her a diagnosis. But there is no way you're making these kind of grandiose statements about forgiving people and that you're granting this forgiveness if you are not completely, like, she is disordered thinking. And so that was kind of my big takeaway from everything she has said, is that why it's so shocking to people and why it's so upsetting is because of all the power she is giving herself in making these determinations of who needs forgiveness. So anyway, I'm not going to go through and read like her entire statement because I'm sure everybody's heard it at this point. But that was the main part of the letter that wasn't included in her statement. So I at least wanted to go through that. There's something else I wanted to discuss, but if I can't think of it right away, then I'll just leave it for another video. One of my kids had pneumonia, and I've been sick with an upper respiratory deal, so I've meant to post more content for you guys, but it just hasn't happened. So if you have any thoughts on especially the whole giving people forgiveness aspect, that was the one part of it that I feel like people are, when they're commenting on it, they're kind of not looking at it from the correct perspective, when they're like, well, Sarah, that's not real forgiveness. But, you know, Sarah doesn't need to be forgiving anybody. That's not, if anything, she should be begging others for forgiveness for her actions. And, you know, that's obviously, that's never going to happen. And I think the fact that she was allowed to use a battered spouse syndrome defense, and literally, you know, she talks about how Judge Kraynick is so biased against her and, you know, just against her in general. But yet he basically, I mean, let's be real. Okay, she had to come up with an overt act that put her in fear in order to qualify to use that battered spouse syndrome defense. We all know that her saying that George stuck his fingers through the suitcase was completely made up. It was a way for her to have that scintilla of, you know, that's what the word the judge used was, a scintilla of an overt act, in order to be able to use that as her defense. And technically, if she's willing to testify to something in court, then that is considered evidence, and it's up to the jury to decide whether or not they believe her. But I think it's completely fabricated. I also think her saying George became really angry in those 10 minutes where there was no recording, I don't believe that for a second. I think that was completely made up. And she has made up so much. Like, I think all the abuse is made up. And she has gotten so used to fabricating all this stuff that I think she believes her own lies at this point. And she's delusional. So, I mean, Sarah Boone is always going to be Sarah Boone. And I don't anticipate her to ever be remorseful, because she believes her own delusions. So anyhow, so yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about in regards to that letter that she wrote. If you go to the Orange County Courthouse website, you can read it for yourself. It's really easy to find. Just type in Sarah Boone and it gives you all the court documents free of charge. It's totally something available to the public. That's part of our court system and the transparency that we are allowed via the Constitution. So anyways, I hope you guys are all doing well and that you're having a good holiday season. And I'm going to try to cover, I'm not going to say, I don't want to make any promises as to what's going to be next, but I want to talk a little bit about Karen Reed, because I know her retrial is coming up, possibly next month, but who knows, it could get pushed back. And I want to talk about some of the other cases as we're finding out more information. So if you have any suggestions, I'm happy to hear those as well. Just put them in the comments. Have a nice day. We'll see you guys soon.